I almost canceled an $8 ride request on a rainy Tuesday, but decided to pick up one last elderly passenger instead. That 10-minute drive didn't just earn me a tip. It resulted in me legally inheriting a $32 million empire. This is a story about a secret debt that compounded in the dark for 60 years until it was finally time to be paid. Before I tell you exactly who was sitting in my back seat, let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and please subscribe if you believe that the best revenge is living well. Driving a cab at 73 years old with no family and no hope is a fate I never saw coming. 6 months before that day, I had a life that made sense. It was not a perfect life, but it was mine, and I had built it with my own two hands. I had a 2-story brick house in a decent neighborhood, a wife who had been my partner in every sense of the word for 45 years, and 2 sons who I thought would carry my legacy forward.
Eleanor was everything to me. Every morning for 4 decades, she would make strong coffee with 2 spoonfuls of brown sugar, and the smell of that coffee was the signal that my world was safe. When congestive heart failure took her in March, it happened so fast that I barely had time to say goodbye. In less than 3 months, that smell of fresh coffee disappeared forever, and with it went the center of gravity in my universe. The first few days after the funeral were a blur of heavy silence and sharp pain. The house that once overflowed with her gospel music and her laughter now only had echoes that bounced off the walls. I sat in my armchair staring at the dust motes dancing in the light, waiting for a noise that I knew would never come again. Marcus and Andre. My sons came to visit me for the first few weeks. They brought store-bought fried chicken and empty words that fell flat in the quiet living room. I was grateful at first because I thought they were there to mourn with me. I thought they were there to help their father navigate this new terrifying solitude, but I was blind. I noticed something shifting in their eyes during those visits. They no longer saw me as their father, the man who taught them to ride bikes and tie ties. They saw me as a problem that needed to be calculated and solved. That solution arrived on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, exactly 1 month after we put Eleanor in the ground. Marcus knocked on my door. He was wearing his expensive suit and a watch that cost more than my first car. Andre was with him looking at his phone, avoiding my gaze. They did not hug me. They did not ask how I was sleeping. They walked into the kitchen, and Marcus placed a thick leather folder on the table. The sound of that heavy folder hitting the wood was like a gunshot in the quiet house. He told me to sit down. His voice was cold and professional, the voice of a man closing a deal, not a son talking to his grieving father. I sat down slowly, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. Marcus opened the folder and spread out papers that looked like legal documents. He cleared his throat and started talking about assets and liabilities. He explained that the deed to the house had been technically in Eleanor's name due to a refinancing we did 15 years ago. I nodded because I knew that. What I did not know was the loophole they had found. He explained that since she had passed without a specific will for the property, the house was now part of the estate that they, as her biological children, had a controlling interest in. I stared at him confused. I asked him what he was saying. Andre finally looked up from his phone. He said it simply and without emotion. We are selling the house. Pop. We have decided it is the best move for the family portfolio. We need the liquidity for our own businesses. The air left the room. My chest felt tight. I looked from Marcus to Andre, trying to find the little boys I used to carry on my shoulders, but they were gone. In their place were 2 strangers who looked at my home, my sanctuary, and saw only dollar signs. I asked them where they expected me to live. This was the only home I had known for 40 years. My sweat was in the garden. My memories were in the walls. Marcus answered without blinking. He said I should look for a small apartment, maybe a studio, or a rented room. Something manageable. Something I could afford on my retirement pension. He knew exactly what my pension was. It was $400 a month. It was barely enough to buy groceries and pay the light bill. I told them this. My voice cracked, and I hated myself for showing weakness in front of these men who were stripping me bare. I told them I could not rent anything decent for $400. Marcus just shrugged, adjusting his silk tie. He said they could not support me indefinitely. He said they had their own mortgages and private school tuitions and car notes. He said I had to be realistic. It felt like a knife twisting in my chest, not because of the house, but because of the callousness. My own sons, the boys I drove to football practice, the boys I stayed up with when they had fevers, were throwing me out on the street as if I were nothing more than an expired asset. They gave me 30 days. 30 days to pack up 45 years of life. 30 days to say goodbye to the ghost of my wife. They stood up and gathered their papers. Marcus paused at the door and told me not to make this difficult. He said the real estate agent would be coming by on Thursday to take photos, so I needed to declutter. Declutter. That is what he called my life. When the door clicked shut behind them, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The silence was different now. It was not just the silence of grief. It was the silence of betrayal. I looked at the photos on the mantle. Marcus graduating college. Andre getting married. I realized then that I did not know these men. I had raised them, but I did not know them. They were wolves in designer suits, and I was just an old sheep that had outlived its usefulness. 2 weeks later, I was standing on the sidewalk with 2 suitcases and a box of photos. The locks had been changed. The for sale sign was already up in the yard. I looked back at the house one last time, but I did not cry. I had no tears left. I got into a taxi and gave the driver the address of the only place I could find. It was in a part of the city I used to tell my sons to avoid, a crumbling building where the rent was $300 a month. I arrived, and the landlord, a man with grease stains on his shirt, took my cash without looking me in the eye. He led me up 3 flights of stairs that smelled of urine and boiled cabbage. He opened a door at the end of a dark hallway. The room was the size of a large closet. The walls were a filthy yellow that reminded me of sickness. There was no kitchen, just a hot plate on a rusted metal table. The window looked out onto an alley where trash piled up high enough to touch the glass. I sat on the mattress. The springs screamed under my weight. I could hear the neighbors fighting through the paper-thin walls. I could hear sirens wailing in the distance. I was 73 years old. I was alone. I was poor. And as I opened a can of cold beans for my dinner, I realized that the hardest part was not the poverty. It was knowing that my own blood had put me here. The walls of that room seemed to close in on me a little more every single day. The yellow paint was peeling in long strips, revealing the gray plaster underneath like a wound that refused to heal. It smelled of ancient dampness and the stale cigarette smoke that seeped in from the hallway under the gap in the door. I tried to keep the window open to let in some fresh air, but the alley outside smelled worse than the room. It smelled of rotting garbage and city grit. This was my new reality. This was where Isaiah Freeman was supposed to wait for death. There was no kitchen to speak of, just a rusted electric hot plate that sat on a wobbly table in the corner. Next to it was a small refrigerator that hummed and rattled all night long like a dying animal. It was barely cold enough to keep milk from spoiling, but that did not matter much because I could rarely afford milk. The bathroom was the greatest humiliation of all. It was down the hall and shared with 3 other tenants. I had to wait my turn, listening to the sounds of strangers through the thin door, standing in the dark hallway, clutching my towel and my bar of soap. Every time I walked into that bathroom, I felt a piece of my dignity chip away. The tiles were cracked and covered in grime that no amount of scrubbing could remove. The mirror was broken. The faucet dripped a constant rhythm that echoed in the silence of the night. I thought about the master bathroom in my old house. I thought about the clean white towels Eleanor always kept stacked by the tub. I thought about the smell of lavender soap. Standing there in that filth, waiting to wash my face, I felt a deep, burning shame that made my hands tremble. The mattress in my room had springs that dug into my back no matter how I positioned myself. It was lumpy and stained, and it smelled of the people who had slept there before me. I covered it with the sheets I had brought from home, but even the smell of my own detergent could not mask the scent of poverty. It was all I could afford. My pension check of $400 came at the first of the month. $300 went immediately to the landlord, who snatched it from my hand with greedy fingers. That left me with $100. $100 to last 30 days. That is $3.33 a day. I became a mathematician of misery. A loaf of bread cost $2. A can of beans cost $1. A bus ticket was $2.50. I quickly realized that I could not afford to take the bus. I could not afford to buy coffee. I could not afford to turn on the small electric heater in the room because I was terrified of the electric bill. So I sat in the dark, wrapped in a blanket, eating cold beans from the can and counting the pennies in my pocket. The nights were the hardest.
During the day, I could distract myself by walking to the park or sitting on a bench watching the pigeons. But at night, there was nowhere to go. I would lie awake staring at the water stains on the ceiling that looked like maps of countries that did not exist. I listened to the neighbors fighting through the walls. To my left, there was a couple that screamed at each other until dawn. To my right, there was an old man who coughed until it sounded like his lungs were tearing apart. I wondered how I had ended up here. 73 years of life, 45 years of marriage, 2 sons raised with love and discipline. I had followed the rules. I had paid my taxes. I had gone to church. I had loved my wife. And there I was alone and abandoned in a room that felt like a prison cell waiting for the end. I thought about Eleanor constantly. I talked to her in the dark. I asked her if she could see me. I asked her to forgive me for losing our home. I asked her how our boys could have turned into people we did not recognize. Hunger is a cruel teacher. It does not care about your pride or your past. After 2 weeks of eating only bread and canned beans, I started to feel a weakness in my legs that scared me. I would stand up and the room would spin. My clothes started to hang loosely on my frame. I cinched my belt tighter and tighter, but the pants still bunched at the waist. I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror one morning, and I did not know the man staring back at me. He was gaunt. His eyes were surrounded by deep, dark circles. He looked like a ghost. I knew I had to do something. I could not survive on $100 a month. I was slowly starving to death in that room, and the thought of dying there alone and being found days later by the landlord made my stomach churn. I refused to let that be the end of my story.
I refused to let Marcus and Andre win by simply fading away into the silence they had created for me. I still had one asset left. I had my car. It was a 10-year-old sedan that Marcus had tried to make me sell, but I had refused. It was the only fight I had won during the eviction. I had parked it on the street blocks away because there was no parking at the building. It was old, and the paint was fading, but the engine was sound. I had taken care of that car just like I had taken care of everything in my life. I walked to where it was parked, praying that it was still there. When I saw it sitting under a street lamp covered in city dust, I felt a surge of relief that almost brought me to knees. I got in and started the engine. It roared to life without hesitation. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, feeling the vibration of the motor through my hands. It felt like power. It felt like freedom. I drove to a fast food restaurant not to eat, but to use their free Wi-Fi. I sat in the parking lot and downloaded a ride-sharing app on my old smartphone. I had heard people talking about it. Driving strangers for money. It seemed like a young man's game, but I had no choice. I stared at the screen. The application asked for my license, my insurance, my background check. My hands were sweating as I typed in the information. I was terrified they would reject me because of my age. Who wants a 73-year-old driver who wants to get into a car with a man who looks like he is losing a fight with life? But I hit submit anyway. I stared at the processing wheel spinning on the screen. It was my last hope. If this did not work, I didn't know what I would do. I could not beg. I could not steal. 2 days later, I got the notification. I was approved. They sent me a digital sticker for my windshield and access to the driver portal. That was it. No interview. No human looking me in the eye to judge my worth.
Just an algorithm that said I was good enough to drive. I sat in my room that night looking at the phone screen. I felt a strange mixture of fear and determination. I was going to work. I was going to survive. I was Isaiah Freeman, and I was not done yet. The next morning, I woke up at 5. I washed my face with cold water in the dirty sink down the hall. I put on my best shirt, which I had ironed on the floor of my room using a towel as a board. I polished my shoes until they shined. I might be living in a slum. I might be poor. But I would not look like a beggar. I walked to my car, breathing in the cool morning air. I got in and turned on the app. My heart was pounding in my chest as I waited. And then it happened. A loud ping echoed in the quiet car. A request. My first passenger. I stared at the map, seeing the pickup location. It was real. I took a deep breath, whispered a prayer to Eleanor, and tapped accept.
I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, leaving the smell of dampness and despair behind me. I was a driver now, and for the first time in months, I had a destination. I thought the first day would be the hardest part of this new life, but I was wrong. The first day was just adrenaline and fear. The hardest part was the second day, and the third day, and the 30th day, when the adrenaline faded and the crushing reality set in. I was a 73-year-old man competing in a game designed for 20-year-olds with endless energy. The app was a relentless master that did not care about my arthritis or my grief. It only cared about acceptance rates and pickup times. I drove 12 hours a day, sometimes 14. I started at 6 in the morning when the city was still waking up, and I did not turn the engine off until 8 or 9 at night. My hands cramped around the steering wheel until they looked like claws. My legs would swell so much that by the end of the shift, I could barely walk from the car to the front door of my building. My lower back burned with a constant dull fire that never went away no matter how many aspirin I swallowed. The car became my entire world. It was a metal box where I witnessed the lives of strangers in 10-minute increments. People got in and out like I was part of the upholstery. They sat in the back seat talking loudly on their phones, arguing with their spouses, or eating messy sandwiches that left crumbs on the seats I had to clean. Most of them did not even say hello. I was not Isaiah Freeman to them. I was not a father or a widower or a man who used to have a home. I was just the back of a head. I was just a service. One rainy afternoon, a young man in a sharp suit got into the car. He was probably the same age as my son Marcus. He was shouting into his phone about a merger and an incompetent assistant. I missed a turn because the GPS lagged for a second and he exploded. He kicked the back of my seat and yelled at me to wake up. He called me a stupid old man. He told me I should be in a nursing home, not on the road. I gripped the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white.
I wanted to stop the car and tell him that I had built a life before he was even born. I wanted to tell him about the house I had lost and the wife I was mourning. I wanted to demand respect, but I swallowed my pride. It tasted like ash in my throat. I apologized. I told him it would not happen again. I needed the 5-star rating. I needed the $12 for the ride. My dignity had a price tag now, and it was terrifyingly low. The money was a constant source of panic. I worked 14 hours a day, but after paying for gas, which seemed to go up every week, and the maintenance on the car, and the commission the app took, I was barely breaking even. Every time I hit a pothole, I flinched, praying it did not damage the suspension. Every time the engine made a strange noise, my heart stopped. A breakdown meant the end. If the car died, I died. I stopped buying anything that was not absolutely essential. I gave up the cheap coffee I used to buy at gas stations.
I drank water from public fountains. I ate plain white rice and boiled beans every single night. I lost weight rapidly. My pants started to fall off my hips. When I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw a stranger staring back. His cheeks were hollow. His skin was gray. His eyes were dull and defeated. I had lost over 20 pounds since Eleanor died. I was fading away physically, just as I had faded away from the lives of my sons. Sundays were a special kind of torture. Sundays used to be the best day of the week. Eleanor would cook a roast or fried chicken. The house would smell of spices and love. We would sit on the porch and watch the neighbors pass by. Now Sundays were just another workday. I drove people to church. I drove families to brunch. I watched elderly couples holding hands in the back seat, and the jealousy I felt was so sharp it felt like a physical wound. Every happy passenger was a reminder of everything I had lost. 4 months passed like this. It's passed like
4 months of exhaustion and loneliness and fear. I did not get a single call from Marcus or Andre. Not one message to see if I was still alive. It was as if I had been erased from the family history. There were nights when I parked the car on a bridge and looked down at the black water and thought about how easy it would be to just stop fighting. But then I would hear Eleanor's voice in my head telling me to stand up. So I kept going. Then the disaster I had been dreading finally happened. It was a Tuesday morning, and the check engine light flickered on. It was a small orange light, but it terrified me more than a gun pointed at my face. The car started to shudder when I idled. I took it to a mechanic I knew from the old days, hoping he would give me a break. He looked at it and shook his head. It needed a new alternator and a belt. The cost was $300. I checked my bank account. I had $42. I checked my pockets. I had $8 in tips.
I stood there in the grease-stained garage, feeling the walls closing in. I could not drive without the repair. I could not make money without driving. It was the end. I was going to lose the car, and then I would lose the room, and then I would be on the street. I looked down at my left wrist. I was wearing a gold watch. It was a simple piece with a leather band. Eleanor had given it to me for our 25th anniversary. She had saved for 2 years to buy it. It was the most valuable thing I owned. It was the physical weight of her love on my arm. I had never taken it off. Not when I slept, not when I showered. I touched the cold metal face and felt tears stinging my eyes. I walked out of the garage and drove the shuddering car to a pawn shop 3 blocks away. I stood at the counter while the man behind the glass examined the watch with a jeweler's loupe. He did not care about the anniversary. He did not care about the woman who saved her grocery money to buy it. He just saw gold and gears. He offered me $200. I begged for 3. I told him I needed to fix my car to work. He stared at me with dead eyes and offered $250. I took the money. As I walked out of the shop, leaving my wife's gift behind in a tray of discarded memories, I felt something inside me break. I felt less human. I paid the mechanic and got back on the road, but I drove through a blur of tears. I was hollowed out. I was a machine operating a machine. That afternoon, I almost crashed. I was drifting across lanes on the highway, my eyes heavy with exhaustion, my mind numb with grief. A semi-truck blasted its horn, and I swerved back into my lane at the last second, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I pulled over to the shoulder and put my head on the steering wheel. I was shaking uncontrollably. I realized then that I could not keep doing this. I was running on fumes. I was going to kill someone, or kill myself. I sat there on the side of the highway, watching the cars rush by, and I prayed. I did not pray for money. I did not pray for my house back. I just prayed for a way out. I prayed for an end to the endless downward spiral. I did not know that the answer was already hurtling towards me in the form of a ride notification. I wiped my face, took a deep breath, and looked at the phone. A request popped up. General Hospital. Destination downtown. It was a short trip, probably $8. I almost declined it. I was so tired, but I needed every penny to buy back the watch. I tapped accept and merged back into traffic, not knowing that I was driving towards the moment that would change everything. General Hospital was a maze of concrete and glass that I usually tried to avoid. The traffic around the entrance was always a nightmare of ambulances and stressed families fighting for parking spots, but I did not have the luxury of being picky anymore. I needed the fare. I pulled my sedan into the designated pickup zone and put it in park. The engine idled with a rough vibration that rattled my teeth, a constant reminder of the repair I could not afford. I checked the app. The passenger's name was Arthur. I watched the automatic doors slide open and close, spitting out people who looked exhausted and worried. 5 minutes passed, then 10. I was about to cancel the ride and move on because time was literally money, but then I saw him. An old man emerged from the shadows of the lobby. He was moving slowly, leaning heavily on a dark wooden cane that looked like it was carved from mahogany. He was different from the usual passengers I picked up here. He was not wearing sweatpants or hospital scrubs. He was wearing a charcoal gray suit that was perfectly pressed, a navy blue tie made of silk, and shoes that shone even under the harsh hospital lights. His hair was completely white and combed back with care. Everything about him screamed money. He looked like old wealth, the kind of man who had never had to worry about the price of milk or the cost of a tank of gas. He stood on the curb looking around with a confused expression. I realized he was Arthur. I checked my own reflection in the rearview mirror. I saw the hollow cheeks and the cheap shirt. I felt a pang of shame, but I pushed it down. I was doing a job. I got out of the car to help him. It was a courtesy most drivers did not offer anymore, but my father had raised me better than that. I walked around the car and opened the back door. I extended my hand to help him down the curb. He was looking at his phone, trying to figure out the app, but when he saw my hand, he looked up. Our eyes met, and in that instant, the noisy, chaotic world around us seemed to go completely silent. He stood frozen on the sidewalk. His face, which had been calm a moment ago, transformed into a mask of absolute shock. The color drained from his skin, leaving him looking as pale as the hospital sheets. His eyes were a piercing light blue, and they went wide with disbelief. His mouth fell open slightly, and the expensive cane trembled in his hand. I thought he was having a stroke. I instinctively reached out to steady him, gripping his elbow. I asked him if he was okay. I asked him if he needed me to call a nurse. He did not answer. He just stared at me with an intensity that made me want to look away. He was looking at my face as if he were seeing a ghost from his past. He was searching my features, my eyes, my nose, the set of my jaw. It was uncomfortable and intimate and terrifying. Finally, he spoke. His voice was rasping and thick with emotion. He asked me my name. It was not the usual polite question passengers ask. It was a demand. It was a desperate plea. I was confused, but I answered him. I told him my name was Isaiah. Isaiah Freeman. The moment he heard my last name, his knees seemed to give out. If I had not been holding his arm, he would have collapsed right there on the concrete. Tears, real heavy, tears started to well up in his blue eyes and roll down his wrinkled cheeks. He repeated my name. Freeman. Freeman. He said it like it was a prayer he had been whispering for decades. Then he asked the question that stopped my heart. He asked with a broken voice if I knew a man named Elijah Freeman. I felt the air leave my lungs. Elijah Freeman was my father. He had been a mechanic his whole life. He had died 30 years ago from a sudden heart attack while working under a truck. He was a good man, a simple man who never had 2 dimes to rub together. I had not heard his name spoken by a stranger in years. I told him yes. I told him Elijah was my father, but that he had passed away a long time ago. The old man closed his eyes tightly and let out a sound that was half sob and half laugh. He whispered something to himself that I could not catch. Then he opened his eyes again and looked at me with an expression that I will never forget. It was a mix of profound relief, deep sadness, and overwhelming guilt. He squeezed my arm with a strength that surprised me. He told me that he had been looking for my family for 60 years. 60 years. I stood there on the curb completely baffled. I did not know this man. I had never seen him before in my life. My father had never mentioned any rich friends. My father fixed Fords and Chevys in a greasy garage. He did not know men who wore silk ties and walked with mahogany canes. But this man spoke with such conviction that I could not dismiss him. He was shaking. He was crying. This was not a prank. He looked at the car and then back at me. He told me to cancel the destination. He said we were not going downtown to his condo. He asked me to take him to his office instead. He said there was something he needed to show me. Something he had kept in a safe for 6 decades waiting for this exact moment. He said it had to do with my father and a debt that was never paid. I hesitated. My mind was racing. I was a driver. I had a job to do. I could not just go off route with a stranger who might be senile or confused, but then I looked at his eyes again. There was no madness there. There was only a desperate sincerity. He reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a white handkerchief to wipe his face. He apologized for his reaction. He told me his name was Arthur Sterling. He begged me to trust him for just 1 hour. He said he was asking for 1 hour of my time in exchange for answers I did not even know I needed. He said he owed it to Elijah. He said he owed it to me. Something in his voice broke through my defenses. Maybe it was the mention of my father.
Maybe it was the fact that I had just prayed for a way out less than an hour ago. I nodded. I helped him into the back seat. He settled in, carefully treating his body like fragile glass. I got back into the driver's seat and looked at him in the rearview mirror. He was staring out the window, wiping his eyes, lost in a memory I could not see. I asked him for the address. He gave me a location in the financial district, the heart of the city's wealth. It was the place where the skyscrapers touched the clouds and billions of dollars moved through fiber optic cables every second. It was a place I never went unless I was dropping someone off to make money I would never see. I put the car in drive and pulled out into traffic. My hands were gripping the wheel, but this time it wasn't from exhaustion. It was from a strange, nervous anticipation. The check engine light was still glowing orange on the dashboard, but I barely noticed it.
I had a passenger named Arthur Sterling in my back seat who claimed to know my dead father. I had no idea where we were going or what we would find there, but as I merged onto the highway, I had a feeling that the road I was on was about to take a turn I could never turn back from. The drive to the financial district took 40 minutes of agonizing silence. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror every few seconds, trying to understand what was happening, but Arthur just stared out the window with a distant expression, lost in a world I could not see. He looked fragile in the back seat, like a porcelain doll that had been cracked and glued back together. The traffic was heavy, as it always was at that hour, but the cars seemed apart for us, as if fate itself was clearing the path. We finally pulled up to the curb in front of the Sterling Tower. It was a 50-story building with a glass and steel facade that reflected the clouds. It was the kind of place where important people made decisions that changed the price of bread for people like me. It was a fortress of wealth. I put the car in park and the engine sputtered and died with a final exhausted cough. I felt a flush of embarrassment knowing that my rusted sedan was parked next to limousines and luxury sports cars. Arthur asked me to come inside with him. I hesitated for a moment. I looked down at my worn-out shoes and my cheap pants that were frayed at the hem. I did not belong in a place like this. I belonged in the service entrance or the loading dock. But Arthur was already opening his door, struggling to get his legs out. I pushed my insecurity down and got out to help him. The moment we walked through the revolving glass doors, the noise of the city vanished. It was replaced by a hushed silence and the smell of expensive air freshener that smelled like white tea and money. The lobby was cavernous with gleaming marble floors that were polished to a mirror finish. There were huge decorative plants in ceramic pots that probably cost more than my car. A security guard in a dark blazer stood behind a massive stone desk. He saw us approaching and immediately straightened up. He greeted Arthur by name with a tone of deep respect and hurried to call the elevator. He did not look at me. To him, I was invisible. I was just the help. I walked beside Arthur, listening to the click of his cane on the marble. It was a slow, rhythmic sound that echoed in the vast space. We stepped into the elevator and the doors slid shut, cutting us off from the world. There were no buttons inside, just a key card slot. Arthur took a gold card from his wallet and swiped it. The elevator began to rise smoothly. My ears popped as we shot upward, passing floor after floor, lawyers and bankers and hedge fund managers. I watched the numbers climb higher and higher until we reached the top. The penthouse. The doors opened directly into a private office. There was no hallway or reception area. It was just one massive room that took up the entire floor. I stepped out onto a plush carpet that felt like walking on moss. The office was breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the entire city. I could see the harbor, the bridges, and the grid of streets stretching out to the horizon. From up here, the miserable neighborhood where I lived looked small and insignificant. The furniture was antique, made of solid, dark wood that shone with polish. There were shelves filled with leather-bound books that looked like they had been read 100 times. There were paintings on the walls that looked like they belonged in a museum. Everything in the room screamed of history and power and accumulated success. Arthur walked slowly to a large mahogany desk in the center of the room and placed his cane on top of it. He motioned for me to sit in one of the leather chairs facing the desk. I sat down slowly, feeling completely out of place. The leather was soft and cool against my back. Arthur did not sit. He walked past the desk to a corner of the room where a large painting of a stormy seascape hung on the wall. He reached out with trembling hands and swung the painting to the side on hidden hinges. Behind the painting was a wall safe. It was old, the kind you see in black and white movies, with a heavy steel door and a mechanical combination dial in the center. The green paint on the metal was faded and chipped in places, revealing the gray steel underneath. It looked like a relic from another time, a piece of the past preserved in this modern tower of glass. Arthur looked back at me before he touched the dial. His eyes were wet again. He told me that what he was about to show me had been waiting in the dark for 60 years. He said he had promised himself he would not open this safe again until he found a Freeman. Then he turned back to the safe and began to turn the dial. Left, right, left again. I could hear the metallic clicks of the tumblers falling into place. My breathing became shallow. The room was perfectly silent except for the sound of the safe mechanism. I gripped the armrest of the chair until my fingers hurt. I did not know what to expect. Gold bars, diamonds, a confession of a crime. My imagination was running wild, but I felt in my gut that whatever was in that safe was going to rewrite my history. The heavy steel door opened with a groan of rusty hinges. Arthur reached inside into the darkness. He did not pull out stacks of cash or jewels. He pulled out a simple old leather folder. The leather was cracked with age, and the corners were worn down to the suede, and he held it with both hands as if it were a holy scripture. He walked back to the desk and placed the folder in front of me. He sat down heavily in his chair and let out a long breath that sounded like a weight leaving his soul. He nodded at the folder, giving me permission to open it. My hands were shaking as I reached out. I undid the leather strap and opened the cover. Inside, there were documents that had yellowed with time. The paper was brittle and smelled of old dust. On top of the stack was a black and white photograph. I picked it up carefully, terrified I might damage it. It was a picture of two young men standing in front of a small brick building with a sign that said auto repair. One of the men was clearly Arthur. He looked about 25 years old with dark hair and a wide, confident smile. He was wearing a suit even then, although it looked cheap and ill-fitting. The other man made my heart stop beating in my chest. He was wearing mechanic coveralls that were stained with grease. He had a wrench in his back pocket and a smudge of oil on his cheek. He had his arm around Arthur's shoulder in a gesture of easy friendship. I knew that face. I saw it every time I looked in the mirror. I saw it every time I closed my eyes and thought about my childhood. It was my father. It was Elijah Freeman. But he looked so young. He looked happy. He looked full of life and strength. I had only known him as an older, tired man, worn down by years of hard labor. Seeing him like this, frozen in a moment of joy with this wealthy stranger, broke something inside me. I looked up at Arthur. He was watching me with tears streaming down his face. He confirmed what my heart already knew. He told me that was Elijah. He told me that was the day everything changed. He told me that without the man in that photograph, he would be nothing. He would be dust. He pointed to the documents underneath the photo. He told me to read them. He said that inside that folder was the story of a debt that had haunted him for a lifetime. A debt he had tried to pay for 6 decades. He said that I was not just a driver who picked him up at a hospital. I was the creditor he had been searching for. I looked back down at the yellowed papers. My eyes blurred. I saw my father's signature at the bottom of a document. It was strong and clear, Elijah Freeman. And next to it was a date, October 14th, 1965. Arthur settled deeper into his leather chair and began to speak. His voice was soft but clear, filling the quiet room with the ghosts of 1965. He told me that back then he was a 30-year-old man who had just inherited a dying textile mill from his father. He was not the titan of industry I saw before me. He was a failure. He had made bad decisions and trusted the wrong partners, and the family legacy was crumbling in his hands. He was drowning in debt, and the banks had closed their doors to him. He told me about the night he met my father. It was a rainy Tuesday, much like the day my sons evicted me. Arthur was sitting in a small dive bar near the factory district trying to drink enough whiskey to forget that he was going to lose everything the next morning. He was terrified. He was ashamed.
He was contemplating ending his life to escape the humiliation. That was when Elijah Freeman walked in.
My father was wearing his work clothes covered in the grime of a 12-hour shift at the garage. In 1965, a white businessman in a suit and a black mechanic in coveralls did not usually drink together. There were lines that were not supposed to be crossed. But misery has a way of erasing lines. Arthur was crying into his glass, and my father sat down next to him. He didn't judge him. He did not mock him. He just asked him what kind of trouble could make a man look so broken. Arthur told him everything. He poured his heart out to this stranger. He told him about the creditors who were coming to seize the machines. He told him about the workers he would have to fire. He told him about the shame of destroying his family name. My father listened in silence, sipping his beer and nodding slowly. Then my father did something that Arthur said he still could not fully comprehend 60 years later. Elijah reached into his pocket and pulled out a bank book. He told Arthur that he had been saving every penny he earned since he was 14 years old. He had saved to buy his own garage. He had saved to buy a house for his wife and the children he hoped to have one day. It was his freedom money. My father told Arthur that he had $30,000 in that account. I gasped audibly in the quiet office. $30,000 in 1965 was a fortune. It was enough to buy 3 houses. It was a lifetime of sweat and oil and busted knuckles. It was literally everything my father had in the world. Arthur told me he laughed when he heard it. He thought it was a joke. But my father was dead serious. He told Arthur that he had watched him over the years. He had seen how Arthur treated his workers with respect. He had seen that Arthur was a good man caught in a bad storm. He said that money was just a tool, and sometimes you have to lend your tools to a neighbor to help them fix their house. 2 days later, they met at the bank. My father withdrew the money, all of it. He handed a paper bag filled with cash to Arthur. There were no lawyers present. There were no long contracts with fine print. My father did not believe in that. He believed in a man's word. He believed in the look in a man's eye. They sat in Arthur's car and wrote a simple agreement on a piece of notebook paper. My father wrote it out in his neat block letters. Elijah Freeman loans Arthur Sterling $30,000. In exchange, Arthur Sterling grants Elijah Freeman 30% ownership of Sterling Textiles. They both signed it. They shook hands. And then my father went back to work at the garage as if he had not just gambled his entire future on a stranger. Arthur used that money to pay off the most aggressive creditors. He bought raw materials. He fixed the broken looms. It was the lifeline he needed. The business did not just survive, it began to thrive. The industry turned around and Sterling Textiles became profitable within 6 months. Arthur worked day and night, driven by the promise he had made to the mechanic who saved him. A year later, Arthur went back to the garage to find my father. He had the first dividend check in his pocket. He wanted to make Elijah a partner officially. He wanted to celebrate. But when he got to the garage, the owner told him that Elijah Freeman had quit. He said Elijah had packed up his tools and left town without saying where he was going. Arthur was devastated. He went to the address he had for my father, but the small apartment was empty. He asked the neighbors, but nobody knew anything. It was as if Elijah Freeman had vanished into thin air. Arthur hired private investigators. He placed ads in newspapers in other cities. He spent years looking for the man who saved his life, but he never found him. I sat there listening to this story, feeling the tears running down my own face. I knew why my father had left. I remembered the stories my mother used to tell in hushed tones. There had been trouble in 1966. Some local men didn't like that a black mechanic was doing well. There were threats. There was a brick thrown through a window. My father had moved us to the other side of the state in the middle of the night to keep us safe. He had left everything behind to protect his family. He never told us about the money. He never told us about the shares. He chose our safety over his fortune. Arthur wiped his eyes and looked at me. He told me that for 60 years he had kept those shares safe. He never sold them. He never diluted them. He reinvested the dividends. He managed that 30% as if Elijah were watching over his shoulder every single day.
He said that Sterling Textiles grew from one mill into a global empire. It expanded into technology, into real estate, into shipping.
And through it all, 30% of everything always belonged to Elijah Freeman. He reached for the folder again and pulled out a document that looked brand new. It was a stock certificate printed on heavy paper with a gold seal. It was dated today. It was issued to the estate of Elijah Freeman. Then he pulled out a second document. It was a valuation report from an accounting firm. He slid it across the desk toward me. He told me to look at the number at the bottom of the page. I looked down. The number swam before my eyes. I blinked to clear my vision. I saw a 3, then a 2, then a string of zeros that seemed to go on forever. $32 million. My breath caught in my throat. The room started to spin. I gripped the edge of the desk to keep from falling out of the chair. I read it again. $32 million. That was the current value of the shares my father had bought with his life savings in 1965.
Arthur spoke softly through the ringing in my ears. He said that was the principal value. That did not include the accumulated dividends from the last 60 years, which were sitting in a separate escrow account. He said the money had been waiting in the dark, just like the agreement in the safe. I looked at the photo of my father again, the young man with the grease on his face. He had died poor. He had died worrying about paying the electric bill. He had died fixing other people's cars until his heart gave out. And all that time he was a silent partner in an empire. He was a millionaire who walked in overalls. I thought about the beans I ate for dinner. I thought about the $400 pension. I thought about the way my sons looked at me with pity and contempt. And suddenly a laugh bubbled up in my chest. It was a hysterical, broken sound. I was sitting in a penthouse wearing a cheap shirt and holes in my socks, and I was worth $32 million.
Arthur reached across the desk and put his hand on mine. His skin was paper thin and cold, but his grip was firm. He told me that the search was over. He told me that the debt was finally being paid. He told me that Elijah Freeman had made the best investment in history, and now his son was here to collect the return.
$32 million. The number sat there on the heavy bond paper like a physical weight that I could not lift. I stared at the commas and the zeros and the neat black font, but my brain refused to process what I was seeing. It was a sequence of digits that belonged to another world, a world of private jets and mansions, not the world of a 73-year-old man who had to pawn his dead wife's watch just to buy gas. I felt a wave of nausea roll through my stomach. The room tilted sideways, and for a terrifying second I thought I was going to pass out right there on the Persian rug. I pushed the paper away as if it were burning hot. I looked at Arthur and shook my head. I told him this could not be real. I told him it had to be a mistake, or a cruel joke, or a clerical error. I told him that people like me do not inherit fortunes. People like me inherit debts and high blood pressure and early graves.
I stood up because I needed to pace. I needed to move. I needed to feel my feet on the ground to make sure I was still on earth. I walked to the window and looked down at the city. The cars were tiny specks moving in the arteries of the streets. Somewhere down there was my rusted sedan with the check engine light on. Somewhere down there was the closet-sized room with the peeling yellow paint. Somewhere down there was the pawn shop where my watch was sitting in a tray. And up here in the clouds was a piece of paper that said, I could buy that pawn shop, and the building it stood in without even checking my bank balance. Arthur watched me with patient eyes. He did not try to stop me. He let the silence stretch out until my breathing slowed down. Then he spoke again. He told me that he understood the shock. He told me that for years he had watched the account grow, and even he had trouble comprehending the magnitude of it. He explained that money has a way of multiplying when you leave it alone, when you let it work in the dark. He called it the magic of compound interest, but then he corrected himself. He said it was not just compound interest, it was compound guilt. He told me that every time the company had a good year, which was almost every year, he felt a pang of pain because Elijah was not there to celebrate it. Every time he signed a dividend check, he felt like a thief because he was keeping money that did not belong to him. He said he had hired the best money managers in the world to handle this specific account. He gave them one instruction: protect the principal and grow the asset. He told them it was a sacred trust. He told them that one day the owner would return, and he wanted to be able to look him in the eye and say he had been a faithful steward. Arthur started to cough then. It was a wet, rattling sound that seemed to come from deep inside his chest. He grabbed a handkerchief and covered his mouth and his whole body shaking with the effort. When he pulled the cloth away, I saw a spot of red blood on the white linen. He quickly folded it and put it away, but he saw that I had noticed. He looked at me with a sad smile. He told me that he did not have much time left. He said the doctors had given him 3 months, maybe 4. The cancer was in his lungs and it was aggressive. He said he was not afraid of dying. He was 85 years old and he had lived a full life, but he was terrified of dying with a red ledger. He was terrified of meeting my father in the next life and having to tell him that he had stolen his legacy. He leaned forward in his chair, gripping the edge of the desk with his thin hands. He told me that this money was not a gift. It was not charity. It was restitution. He said that my father had bought this fortune with his sweat and his risk and his exile. When Elijah left town to protect his family, he left behind his share of the American dream. Arthur had simply held on to it for him. He said that if I did not take it, if I walked out of that door, the money would eventually be absorbed into the general estate or taken by the government, and that would be the final tragedy of Elijah Freeman's life. I looked back at the photo of my father. I looked at his grease-stained face and his proud smile. I thought about the sacrifices he had made that I never knew about. I thought about the nights he came home exhausted, the years he drove old cars so we could have new shoes, the quiet dignity with which he accepted his station in life. He had never complained. He had never been bitter. And now I knew why. He knew who he was. He knew what he was worth, even if the world did not. I sat back down in the leather chair. The panic was fading, replaced by a heavy, solemn feeling. This was not a lottery win. This was not free money. This was a burden. It was a responsibility. It was the weight of my father's life placed into my hands 60 years later. I looked at Arthur, and I saw the desperation in his eyes. He needed me to take this money as much as I needed to have it. He needed absolution. He needed to be free. I asked him what I needed to do. Arthur let out a breath that sounded like a tire deflating. The tension left his shoulders. He closed his eyes for a second and whispered, "Thank you." Then he pressed a button on his intercom. He spoke to his secretary, a woman named Fiona. He told her to send in Mr. Vance. He looked at me and explained that Vance was his personal attorney and the only other person alive who knew the full story. He said Vance had been preparing the legal framework for this transfer for decades. He said they had created an ironclad trust to protect the assets so that when the heir was finally found, the transition would be seamless and instant. I sat there in the silence, waiting for the lawyer to arrive, and I thought about the beans again. I thought about how tonight I would not have to eat beans. I could eat steak. I could eat lobster. I could buy a restaurant. But strangely, the hunger I had felt for months was gone. It was replaced by a fire in my belly, a need to make this count, a need to make sure that my father's sacrifice was not in vain. The door opened, and a tall man in a dark suit walked in carrying a briefcase. He looked like a shark in human clothing, but when he saw Arthur, he smiled with genuine warmth. Arthur introduced him as Stephen Vance. Vance turned to me and extended his hand. He did not look at my frayed cuffs or my cheap shoes. He looked me in the eye with a gaze that was sharp and assessing. He said it was an honor to finally meet the man behind the mystery. He said he had been waiting for this day for 30 years. He sat down and opened his briefcase, revealing stacks of documents that were flagged with colorful sticky notes. He told me that we had a lot of work to do. He said we needed to verify my identity legally. He said we needed to prove the lineage. He said we needed to sign papers that would change the trajectory of my family line forever. I looked at the stack of papers, and then I looked at the check engine light glowing in my mind. I took a deep breath. I was Isaiah Freeman. I was the son of Elijah Freeman.
and I was ready to collect what was owed. Stephen Vance was a man who moved with the precision of a Swiss watch. He did not waste time with small talk or emotional platitudes. He laid out the documents on the mahogany desk in a perfect grid, lining up the edges with a geometry that seemed almost obsessive. He explained that while Arthur's heart told him I was Elijah's son, the law required something more concrete than a facial resemblance and a gut feeling. We were dealing with a transfer of wealth that would trigger IRS audits and regulatory scrutiny. There was no room for error. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a sterile plastic package. It was a DNA collection kit. He explained the process in a flat, clinical voice. They had obtained a genetic sample from my father's autopsy records 30 years ago. It was a standard procedure in cases of sudden cardiac death at that hospital, and the tissue samples had been preserved in the state archives. Arthur's legal team had secured access to them years ago, in anticipation of this very day. Vance put on a pair of latex gloves and handed me the swab. He told me to rub it against the inside of my cheek for 30 seconds. I took the plastic stick. My hand was trembling slightly. I felt like a criminal being processed for a crime I did not commit, or a patient waiting for a terminal diagnosis. I opened my mouth and scraped the inside of my cheek, counting the seconds in my head. 1, 2, 3. It felt surreal. My father's legacy, then the $32 million, the history of the textile mill, all of it came down to a few microscopic cells on a piece of cotton. I handed the swab back to Vance. He sealed it in a biohazard tube and labeled it with a barcode. He told me the results would be expedited. We would have a 99% confirmation within 48 hours. Then he moved to the paperwork. He opened a thick binder titled The Elijah Freeman Irrevocable Trust. He explained the structure to me. Arthur had not just put money in a savings account. He had built a legal fortress. The shares were held in a trust that was designed to be impenetrable. It was protected from lawsuits, creditors, and external claims. Vance looked at me over the rim of his glasses. He said this structure was critical. He said that when people hear about this kind of money, long-lost relatives and friends tend to crawl out of the woodwork. He said the trust ensured that I, and only I, had the authority to distribute the funds. No one could take it from me. No one could force me to sign it over. It was mine, locked behind a wall of steel and ink. I nodded, thinking of Marcus and Andre. I thought about how quickly they had moved to sell Eleanor's house, how efficient they were at stripping me of my assets. I realized with a grim satisfaction that this trust was exactly what I needed. It was a shield against the vultures that I knew would start circling the moment the news broke. Vance turned to the next page and frowned. He looked at my clothes again. He looked at the frayed collar of my shirt and the worn leather of my shoes. He asked me about my current financial situation. It was not a judgment. It was a logistical question. He needed to know if I had the resources to handle the next few days while the legal machinery turned. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. I told him the truth. I told him I had $42 in my checking account. I told him I had $8 in cash in my pocket. I told him I had pawned my wife's watch that morning to pay for a car repair so I could drive him to this office. The room went silent. Arthur made a small noise in his throat, a sound of pained sympathy. Vance did not blink. He simply nodded and typed something into his tablet. He said that was unacceptable. He said the estate had provisions for immediate hardship relief for the beneficiary. He asked for my bank account number and routing number. I recited the numbers from memory. I had memorized them because I checked the balance 3 times a day, hoping for a miracle that never came. Vance typed them in. He tapped the screen a few times and then hit a final button with a decisive click. He told me he had just authorized an emergency advance from the trust's liquid cash reserves. He said it was a standard procedure to ensure the beneficiary could secure legal counsel and safe housing during the transition period. He told me the amount was $50,000. I stared at him. I asked him to repeat the number. $50,000, he said calmly. It should clear in less than 2 minutes. I sat there frozen. $50,000. That was 2 years of my pension. That was 500 rides on the Appy. That was a fortune. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a sharp vibration against my thigh. Then it buzzed again. And again.
The bank app notification sound, which I usually dreaded because it meant an overdraft fee, echoed in the quiet office. I pulled the phone out with shaking hands. The screen was cracked in the corner. I unlocked it and opened the banking app. The loading circle spun for what felt like an eternity. And then the numbers appeared. Current balance $50,042. I stared at the screen. The numbers looked fake. They looked like pixels on a screen that could disappear if I blinked. But they stayed there, green and solid. I felt a lump form in my throat that was so big I could not swallow. I looked up at Vance and then at Arthur. I tried to say thank you, but no sound came out. Arthur smiled weakly. He told me to go. He told me to get a good meal. He told me to buy my watch back. He said we would meet again in 2 days when the DNA results were official and the full transfer could be executed. Vance stood up and shook my hand. He gave me a business card that was heavy and expensive. He told me to call him if I had any trouble with the bank. He told me to be careful walking out of the building. He said I was a high-value individual now, and I needed to start thinking like one. I walked to the elevator in a daze. I rode down the 50 floors, feeling like I was descending from Mount Olympus back to the earth. The doors opened into the lobby, and I walked past the security guard. He nodded at me this time, perhaps sensing the change in my aura, or maybe he just saw me leaving from the executive elevator. I walked out through the revolving doors, and the noise of the city hit me like a physical blow. Sirens, horns, people shouting. It was the same chaotic, dirty, loud city I'd entered an hour ago. But everything looked different. The buildings looked sharper. The colors looked brighter. The air tasted different. I walked to my car, which was still parked at the curb with the hazard lights flashing. A parking enforcement officer was standing next to it writing a ticket. An hour ago, that ticket would have ruined my week. It would have meant skipping meals. It would have meant panic. I walked up to him. He ripped the ticket off his pad and handed it to me without looking up. He said I was in a loading zone. He said the fine was $75. I took the ticket. I looked at the orange paper. And for the first time in 6 months, I smiled. A real, genuine smile. I took out my wallet and looked at the $8 inside. I knew I couldn't pay the ticket with cash right there, but the fear was gone. The crushing weight that had sat on my chest every single morning since Eleanor died had vanished. I got into the car. The engine struggled to start coughing and wheezing. I patted the dashboard gently. I told the car it was okay. I told it that we were going to be okay. I put it in gear and pulled into traffic. I did not turn on the rideshare app. I was done. I was retired. I drove straight to the pawn shop. I did not care about the speed limit. I did not care about the gas mileage. I had $50,000 in my pocket. I parked right in front of the shop and walked in. The bell on the door chimed. The man behind the counter looked up. It was the same man who had given me $250 for my soul just hours ago. I slammed the cash on the counter. I told him I wanted my wife's watch back. He looked at me surprised by the ferocity in my voice. He moved slowly, deliberately, trying to exert his petty power. He told me there was a restocking fee. He told me it would cost $300 to get it back. I did not argue. I did not haggle. I pulled out my debit card. I told him to charge it. I stared him down while he ran the card. When the machine beeped approved, he handed me the watch. I put it back on my wrist. The leather was still warm. I felt the weight of it, the connection to Eleanor, and I closed my eyes. I had reclaimed the first piece of my life, and I was just getting started. Stepping out of the pawn shop with my wife's watch back on my wrist, I felt lighter than air. The heavy leaden feeling that had anchored me to the ground for months had dissolved. I walked down the street, observing the city with new eyes. The buildings were not just looming shadows anymore. They were filled with possibilities. The people rushing by were not potential threats or indifferent strangers. They were just people. I touched the cool leather of the watch band every few seconds just to make sure it was real, just to ground myself in the sudden reversal of fortune. My stomach rumbled a deep, hollow sound that reminded me I'd not eaten anything but a slice of stale bread in 24 hours. But this time, the hunger did not scare me. I walked into a diner on the corner. a place with a neon sign buzzing in the window and the smell of frying onions wafting out the door. It was the kind of place I had walked past 100 times, looking at the menu taped to the glass and counting the coins in my pocket before walking away. Today I didn't look at the prices. I pushed the door open and the bell jingled. A waitress with tired eyes pointed to a booth in the back. I slid onto the red vinyl seat. It was cracked and taped with duct tape, but it felt like a throne. When she came over with her pad, I ordered without hesitation. I asked for the full breakfast, scrambled eggs with cheese, crispy bacon hash browns, buttered toast, and a large orange juice. And coffee. Real coffee. Not the instant powder I mixed with tap water in my room. When the food arrived, the smell almost made me weep. The steam rising from the coffee carried the aroma of roasted beans and comfort. I picked up my fork and my hand trembled slightly. I took the first bite of eggs, and it tasted like redemption. The salt of the bacon, the crunch of the toast, the sweetness of the juice. It was a symphony of flavors that overwhelmed my senses. I ate slowly, savoring every mouthful, closing my eyes to let the warmth spread through my body. I was feeding more than just my stomach. I was feeding my dignity. I paid the bill with a $20 bill and told the waitress to keep the change. She looked at me with surprise, a genuine smile breaking through her fatigue. That smile was the first thing I had bought with my new wealth, and it was worth every penny. After breakfast, I walked to a department store 2 blocks away. I caught my reflection in a shop window and stopped. I saw a man in worn-out pants and a shirt that had been washed too many times. I looked like a man who had given up. I walked into the store, determined to bury that version of Isaiah Freeman. I went to the men's section and started looking at suits. A salesman approached me, his eyes scanning my shoes and my frayed cuffs. He asked if I needed help finding the clearance rack. His tone was polite, but the subtext was clear. You do not belong here. I looked him in the eye and told him I was looking for a charcoal gray suit, a white shirt, and a silk tie. I told him I needed them today. I picked out a suit that felt like water running through my fingers. I picked a shirt made of crisp Egyptian cotton. I picked a pair of black leather shoes that smelled of quality. I went into the fitting room and stripped off my old clothes. I left them in a pile on the floor like a shed skin. I put on the fresh white shirt, buttoning it up to my neck. I pulled on the trousers. I tied the tie with muscle memory that had not faded. I put on the jacket and stepped out to the 3-way mirror. The man staring back at me was familiar. He was the man I used to be before the grief and the betrayal broke me. He stood tall. His shoulders were squared.
The hollows in his cheeks were still there, but the suit gave him a presence, a gravity. I looked like a father. I looked like a man who commanded respect. I paid for the clothes with my debit card and wore them out of the store, carrying my old rags in a bag, which I dropped in the first trash can I passed. I did not go back to the room with the yellow walls. I could not face that smell again. I used my phone to find a furnished executive apartment that offered short-term rentals. It was a clean, modern building with a doorman and a gym. I walked into the leasing office and rented a 1-bedroom unit on the spot, paying 2 months in advance. When I opened the door to the apartment, I was greeted by the smell of lemon polish and clean linen. There was a real kitchen with granite counters. There was a living room with a television that was not from the last century, but the bathroom was the sanctuary. It was white and pristine with a glass shower and fluffy towels.
I turned on the water as hot as I could stand it. I stood under the spray for 20 minutes, scrubbing my skin until it was red. I watched the dirt and the grime of the last 6 months swirl down the drain. I washed away the smell of the old room. I washed away the smell of the passengers who had treated me like furniture. I washed away the shame. I stepped out and dried myself with a towel that was soft and thick. I lay down on the bed, which was enormous and covered in a white duvet. I sank into the mattress, and for the first time in months, my back did not scream in pain. I closed my eyes and listened to the silence. It was a peaceful silence, not the heavy silence of loneliness, but the quiet of safety. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, shattering the moment. I picked it up and looked at the screen. The name flashing there made my stomach tighten. Marcus. It was a missed call. He had not called me in 4 months. He had not called on my birthday. He had not called when the temperature dropped below freezing, but now perhaps sensing a disturbance in the universe, or maybe just needing something, he was calling. I stared at the screen while the phone vibrated again. A voicemail notification popped up. I hovered my finger over the play button. Part of me wanted to hear his voice. Part of me wanted to answer and scream at him, to tell him that I was eating steak while he was probably eating takeout, to tell him that I had found a father figure in a stranger that was better than the sons I had raised, but I did not. I silenced the phone and turned it face down. I was not ready. I needed to be stronger. I needed the final piece of the puzzle before I faced the wolves. 2 days passed in a blur of rest and quiet preparation. I slept for 12 hours at a time, catching up on months of lost rest. I ate well. I walked in the park without looking for discarded newspapers to read. I was rebuilding my strength. On the morning of the third day, I went back to the Sterling Tower. I walked into the lobby wearing my new suit, and the security guard held the door for me with a nod of recognition. I rode the elevator up to the penthouse, feeling a calm focus. Arthur was sitting at his desk, looking paler than before, but his eyes were bright. Stephen Vance was standing by the window holding a blue folder. When I walked in, Vance turned and smiled. It was the smile of a lawyer who had just won the biggest case of his career. He did not waste time. He opened the folder and pulled out a document with a medical seal. He placed it on the desk in front of me. He told me the results were in. He pointed to the bottom line. Probability of paternity 99.9998%. There it was. Scientific proof. I was Elijah Freeman's son. I was the heir. Vance pulled out a second stack of documents. These were the transfer papers. He handed me a heavy fountain pen. He told me that once I signed these, the trust would be unlocked. The $32 million would be legally mine. The shares would be registered in my name. I would be a major shareholder in Sterling Textiles. I looked at Arthur. He nodded slowly, giving me his blessing. I looked at the pen. It felt heavy in my hand. I thought about my father writing his name on a napkin in a bar in 1965. I thought about him wiping grease off his hands to shake on a deal that would save a stranger. I signed my name, Isaiah Freeman. The ink was dark and permanent. Vance took the papers and stamped them with a notary seal. The sound was loud and final. Clack, clack. He looked at me and said, "Congratulations, Mr. Freeman. The transfer has been initiated. The funds will be in your account within the hour." I stood up and walked to the window. I looked out at the city again. I was a millionaire. I was the owner of an empire. But as I looked down at the streets, I did not feel like a king. I felt like a judge. My sons were down there somewhere living their lives unaware that the ground had just shifted beneath their feet. The trial was about to begin, and I was the one holding the gavel. It was as if Arthur Sterling had been holding his breath for 60 years, waiting for that ink to dry. Once my signature was on the page and the burden of the debt was lifted, his body simply decided it was time to rest. Stephen Vance called me at 6 in the morning, just 2 days after the signing ceremony. His voice was steady, professional, but I could hear the cracks of grief around the edges. He told me that Arthur had passed away in his sleep peacefully and without pain. I sat on the edge of my new bed in the silent apartment and felt a profound sense of loss for a man I had barely known. We had only shared a few hours together, but we were bound by a history that spanned generations. He was the keeper of my father's legacy, and in his final act, he had handed that torch to me. I whispered a thank you into the quiet room, hoping that wherever he was, he could hear me. I hoped he had found Elijah. I hoped that they were sitting in a celestial bar somewhere having that drink they never got to finish in 1965. I attended the funeral strictly as an observer. It was held at a private cemetery with manicured lawns that looked more like a golf course than a boneyard. I stood at the very back of the crowd, under the shade of an old oak tree, wearing my new charcoal suit and dark sunglasses. I watched Arthur's children and grandchildren weep. I saw the titans of industry and the politicians shaking hands and offering condolences. They were crying for the industrialist, the philanthropist, the powerful man they knew. But none of them knew the secret that had defined his soul. None of them knew that his empire was built on the kindness of a black mechanic who walked away with nothing. I stood there as the only witness to the truth, and when the coffin was lowered into the ground, I touched the watch on my wrist and turned away. The next morning, I was back in Vance's office. The mood was somber, but business had to continue. The death of the patriarch meant that the estate was in chaos, but my portion, the trust, was completely separate. Vance explained that Arthur had structured it this way specifically to avoid probate court. While the rest of the family was fighting over the mansion and the cars, my assets were already secure. Vance handed me a final document. It was a confirmation of funds. The transfer was complete. The $32 million was sitting in an account with my name on it. It was liquid. It was real. It was mine. I stared at the paper. I expected to feel excitement. I expected to feel the urge to run out and buy a sports car or a mansion, but instead I felt a cold clarity. Money is power. That is what people say, but they are wrong. Money is ammunition, and I had a war to fight. My phone had been buzzing incessantly for the last 3 days. Marcus and Andre were calling. They were leaving voicemails. Their tone had shifted from indifference to a strange, forced casualness. They wanted to talk. They wanted to meet. They said they had been thinking about me. I sat in Vance's office and looked at the phone vibrating on the mahogany desk. I was not the same naive old man they had thrown out 4 months ago. I was not going to walk into a trap blind. I looked at Vance and asked him a question that surprised him. I asked if he knew a good private investigator. Vance raised an eyebrow, but he did not ask why. He wrote a name and a number on a slip of paper. He told me that Reynolds was the best in the city. He was discreet, and he was thorough. I met Reynolds that afternoon in a coffee shop far away from the financial district. He was a small man who looked like an accountant, but his eyes missed nothing. I gave him the names of my sons. I gave him their addresses. I told him I wanted a full financial autopsy. I wanted to know their debts. I wanted to know their credit scores. I wanted to know if they were being sued. I wanted to know exactly why, after 4 months of silence, they were suddenly desperate to talk to their father. Reynolds told me it would take 24 hours. I paid him in cash from a thick envelope I had withdrawn from the bank. It felt good to have the upper hand. It felt good to be the one asking the questions instead of the one begging for answers. I went back to my apartment and waited. I did not answer the phone. I let them sweat. I let them wonder if the old man had died in his misery. The silence was my weapon now. The next day, Reynolds emailed me a PDF file. I opened it on my new laptop. It was a dossier of failure. Marcus was leveraged to the hilt. His business was failing, and he had 3 mortgages on his house. Andre was in even worse shape. He had gambling debts, and his wife had filed for divorce, which was going to freeze his assets. I read the report, and the pieces clicked into place. They were not calling because they missed me. They were not calling because they were sorry. They were calling because the sale of Eleanor's house was not enough. They had burned through that money, and now they were drowning. They needed a lifeline. They probably wanted to ask for a loan for my pension, or see if I had any other hidden assets they could sell. Or maybe they just wanted to dump their guilt on me to feel better about themselves. I closed the laptop. The anger I felt was different this time. It was not the hot, burning rage of betrayal. It was the cold, hard ice of disappointment. I knew exactly what I had to do. The phone rang again at 6 in the evening. It was Marcus. This time I picked it up. I said hello. My voice was calm and steady. Marcus sounded surprised that I had answered. He stammered for a second before finding his rhythm. He put on his best salesman voice. He said, "Hey, Pop." He said it had been too long. He said he and Andre were worried about me. He asked where I was staying. I ignored the question. I asked him what he wanted. He laughed nervously. He said they didn't want anything. They just wanted to see me. They wanted to have dinner. A family dinner? Just like old times. He suggested a chain restaurant that we used to go to when they were kids. a place with cheap steaks and sticky tables. I let the silence hang on the line for a long 10 seconds. I could hear him breathing. I could hear the desperation leaking through the phone. I told him I would be there. I told him tomorrow night at 7. He sounded relieved. He said that was great. He said they had some news to share. He said they had a proposition for me. I hung up the phone without saying goodbye. A proposition. I knew what that meant. They had a new way to use me. They had a new plan to extract value from the father they had discarded. I walked to the closet and looked at my new clothes. I chose a simple outfit. Dark pants, a clean shirt, nothing too flashy. I did not want to tip my hand too early. I wanted them to think I was still the same desperate old man they had evicted. I wanted them to feel comfortable. I wanted them to think they were in control, because when you are hunting wolves, you do not walk into the forest banging a drum. You walk in quietly. You let them circle you. You let them think you are weak. And then when they lunge for your throat, you reveal that you are the one with the teeth. I touched the watch on my wrist. I thought about Arthur dying in peace because he had paid his debt. I thought about my father leaving town to save us. And I realized that tomorrow night was not just a dinner. It was a trial. And I was the judge, the jury, and the executioner. I arrived at the restaurant 10 minutes early. It was a mid-range chain place on the edge of the suburbs, the kind of establishment that served frozen steaks and watery cocktails to families who were too tired to cook. The air inside smelled of fryer grease and artificial lemon cleaner. I had parked my new luxury sedan around the corner in the shadows of a drugstore lot. I didn't want them to see the car. I did not want to give them any warning. I walked the last block, so I would enter with the cold wind on my face, looking like a man who had walked from the bus stop. I spotted them immediately in a booth near the back. They looked terrible. The private investigator's report had given me the facts, but seeing them in person was different. Marcus had gained weight, and his expensive suit looked tight around the shoulders, as if he were carrying a physical load he could not put down. His face was shiny with sweat, even though the restaurant was chilly. Andre looked worse. He was gaunt and twitchy, drumming his fingers on the laminated table with a nervous energy that suggested too much caffeine or too much panic. I approached the table slowly. When they saw me, they both jumped slightly, as if they had been caught plotting a crime. Marcus stood up halfway and offered me a hand that felt damp and clammy. Andre mumbled a hello without making eye contact. I sat down on the vinyl bench opposite them. I kept my coat on. I wanted them to feel my distance. I wanted them to know I was not staying long. A waitress came over and dropped plastic menus on the table. Marcus ordered a pitcher of beer and a basket of mozzarella sticks. He did not ask me what I wanted. He just assumed I would eat whatever scraps were available. It was a small gesture, but it told me everything I needed to know. Nothing had really changed. To them, I was still a dependent. I was still a burden to be managed. The first 10 minutes were a painful dance of small talk. Marcus talked about the weather. Andre complained about the traffic. They asked me generic questions about my health, but they did not listen to the answers. They were just waiting for the right moment to pivot. They were building a runway for whatever heavy plane they were trying to land. Finally, Marcus took a long drink of beer and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He leaned forward and put his elbows on the table. He looked at me with an expression that was supposed to be sincere, but looked more like indigestion. He said, "Pop, we have been doing a lot of thinking lately." Andre nodded vigorously beside him. He said, "Yeah, Pop, we really have. We felt bad about how things went down with Mom's house." I sat perfectly still. I looked from one to the other. I said, "You felt bad? Is that why you didn't call me for 4 months?" Marcus flinched. He said, "Look, we know it looked rough, but we were under a lot of pressure. Business was crazy, and the funeral expenses were high. We made some hasty decisions. We admit that, but we want to make it right. We are family after all, and family sticks together." I waited. I knew there was a but coming. There is always a but with men like Marcus. He continued, "We know you are living in a pretty rough spot right now. We don't want our father living in a slum. It reflects badly on us. So we came up with a solution, a way to help you out and keep the family close." He paused for dramatic effect. I could see him rehearsing the pitch in his head, trying to make it sound like charity
instead of exploitation. He said, I have that apartment above my detached garage. You know the one. It's unfinished right now, but it has a bathroom and electricity. We were thinking you could move in there. We would give it to you for a fraction of market rent. Let's say $350 a month. That is cheaper than what you are paying now, and it is in a nice neighborhood. I stared at him. The garage apartment.
I knew it well. It was a drafty storage space with a concrete floor and a window that didn't seal properly. It was freezing in the winter and an oven in the summer. They were offering me a storage unit, but Andre was not done. He jumped in eager to close the deal. He said, and since you are retired and you have a lot of free time, we thought we could work out a trade. You could help us out a little bit. You know, just light stuff. Keeping the lawn mowed, watching the kids a few afternoons a week when the nanny is off. Maybe washing the cars on weekends. Marcus nodded enthusiastically. He said exactly. It would be a fair exchange. We give you a safe place to live, and you pitch in with the household. It solves your problem, and it helps us out with the maintenance. It is a win-win. I felt a cold sensation spread through my chest. It was not anger. It was clarity. Absolute crystalline clarity. They were not here to apologize. They were here to hire me. They were drowning in debt.
Marcus could no longer afford his landscaper or his pool guy. Andre probably couldn't chip in for the nanny anymore. They looked at their 73-year-old father, and they didn't see a parent. They saw cheap labor. They saw a way to cut their monthly expenses by turning me into a live-in servant. They wanted me to pay them $350 a month for the privilege of mowing their grass and raising their children. I looked at their hopeful faces. They truly believed they were being generous. They had convinced themselves that this insult was a lifeline. They were expecting me to cry with gratitude. They were expecting me to kiss their rings. I took a sip of water. It was warm and tasted of tap chlorine. I set the glass down carefully. I said, let me get this straight. You want me to move into your garage. You want me to pay rent. And you want me to become your gardener and your babysitter. Marcus frowned. He sensed the edge in my voice.
He said, come on, Pop, don't say it like that. It is not like that. It is contributing to the household. It gives you a purpose. What else are you going to do all day? Drive that taxi until you die. We're offering you a way out. I looked at Andre. I asked him, is this your idea too, Andre? Andre looked away. He mumbled, it makes sense, Pop. We are just trying to look out for you. I leaned back against the hard vinyl booth. I looked around the cheap restaurant. I saw a family at the next table, laughing together, sharing a meal. I saw a father wiping ketchup off his daughter's face with a tenderness that made my heart ache. I realized then that I had already lost my sons. I hadn't lost them 4 months ago when they evicted me. I had lost them years ago to greed and selfishness. The men sitting across from me were strangers. They were parasites wrapped in suits. I smiled. It was a dry, humorless smile. I said, I appreciate the offer, boys. It is very revealing. But I am going to have to decline. Marcus looked shocked. He said, what do you mean decline? You can't afford to decline. We know what your pension is. We know where you are living. You are barely surviving, Pop. Don't be too proud to accept help. This is the best offer you are going to get. I shook my head slowly. I said, no, Marcus. I don't think it is. You see, things have changed for me recently. I don't need your garage, and I certainly don't need to be your servant. Ethan squinted at me. He gave a short, mocking laugh. He said, what are you talking about? Did you win a scratch-off ticket or something? Did you find a $20 bill on the sidewalk? Be serious, Pop. You are one step away from a homeless shelter. I looked him dead in the eye. The time for hiding was over. The trap had been set, and they had walked right into it. They had shown me exactly who they were. Now it was time to show them who I was. I said I didn't win the lottery, but I did run into an old friend. A man who knew your grandfather Elijah. A man who knew secrets about this family that I never even suspected.
The air at the table changed. The condescension on their faces flickered and was replaced by confusion. They sensed a shift in the power dynamic, but they couldn't quite understand it yet. Marcus asked, "What friend?" "Grandfather Elijah died 30 years ago. What are you talking about?" I leaned forward. I lowered my voice, so they had to lean in to hear me. I said I met a man named Arthur Sterling. Does that name ring a bell to you big businessmen? I saw the recognition flash in Marcus's eyes. Everyone knew the Sterling name. It was on hospitals. It was on libraries. It was on the skyscraper downtown. He said, "The billionaire. What does he have to do with you?" I said he had everything to do with me, and everything to do with the $32 million he was holding for your grandfather. The silence that followed those words was absolute. It was heavy and thick, like the air before a thunderstorm. Marcus had his mouth open mid-sentence, but no sound was coming out. Andre was staring at me with eyes so wide they looked like they might pop out of his skull. The number 32 million hung in the air between us. It hovered over the basket of cold mozzarella sticks and the pitcher of cheap beer. It was a number that did not belong in a place like this. It was a number that changed the gravity of the room. Ethan was the first to break the paralysis. He let out a nervous, high-pitched giggle. He asked if I was joking. He asked if this was some kind of sick prank born from senility. And he looked around the restaurant as if expecting a camera crew to jump out. I did not smile. I did not blink. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and pulled out a photocopy of the bank statement Stephen Vance had given me. I unfolded it slowly, smoothing the creases against the table. STB. I spun it around and slid it toward them. "Look at the balance," I said softly. Marcus grabbed the paper. His hands were shaking so hard the paper rattled. Andre leaned over his shoulder. I watched their eyes scan the page. I watched them see the bank logo. I watched them see the account holder name, Isaiah Freeman. And then I watched them see the number. The reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. The color flushed back into their faces. The pity and condescension vanished in a heartbeat, replaced by a naked hunger that made my stomach turn. They looked like wolves who had just smelled fresh blood. Marcus looked up at me and his entire posture changed. He sat up straighter. He unbuttoned his tight jacket. He put on a smile that showed too many teeth. He said, "Oh my God, Pop. This is incredible. This is a miracle. $32 million. Do you have any idea what this means for us? For the family." Andre was already nodding his head, bouncing in his seat. He said, "We are rich." We are actually rich. Pop, we have to be smart about this. We have to move fast. You can't leave this money in a standard bank account. You need to diversify. Marcus cut him off, taking charge immediately. He said exactly. Pop, listen to me. I know people. I know wealth managers. I know tax attorneys. You are 73 years old. You can't handle a portfolio this size on your own. It is dangerous. People will try to scam you. You need us. You need family to protect the asset. He was talking fast, tripping over his words in his excitement. He said, "We can set up a family office. I can run the real estate investments. Andre can handle the equities. We can build a dynasty, Pop. The Freeman Empire. We can buy back Mom's house. We can buy 10 houses." I watched them plan my future. I watched them spend my money. 5 minutes ago, I was a burden who needed to live in a garage and mow their lawn for $350 a month. Now suddenly I was the patriarch of a dynasty. Patriarch. Now I was their partner. I let them talk for another minute. I let them dig the hole deeper and deeper. I listened to them argue about whether to buy commercial real estate or tech stocks. I listened to them talk about vacations and new cars. They had completely forgotten that I was a human being. To them, I was just a winning lottery ticket that they needed to cash. I raised my hand and slammed it down on the table. The sound cracked like a whip. "Stop," I said. They both froze. They looked at me confused by the interruption. Marcus said, "Pop, we were just trying to help. We are excited. This changes everything." I looked at him with cold eyes. I said, "It changes nothing for you." The smile faltered on his face. He asked, "What do you mean?" We are family. This is family money. Grandfather Elijah would have wanted us to enjoy it together. I laughed. It was a dark, bitter sound. I said, "You have a lot of nerve talking about what Elijah would have wanted." Elijah was a man of honor.
He was a man of loyalty. You two don't know the meaning of those words. I leaned across the table. I wanted them to see the fire in my eyes. I said, let me remind you of the last 4 months. When you kicked me out of my home, you didn't care about family. When I was living in a room that smelled like urine and mold, you didn't care about family. When I was eating cold beans out of a can because I couldn't afford bread, you didn't care about family. Andre looked down at his lap, shame creeping back into his face, but Marcus tried to argue. He said, Pop, that is unfair. We told you we were struggling. I cut him off. I said, you were struggling, so you decided to throw your father in the trash. You erased me. You didn't call. You didn't visit. You waited until you needed a servant to clean your house, and then you called. And now that you see money, you want to be sons again. I sat back. I felt a great weight lifting off my shoulders. I had been carrying the hope that they would redeem themselves. I had been carrying the hope that they were good men deep down. But the truth was out. They were not good men. They were greedy men. And I was done making excuses for them. I said, I have news for you. That money is not family money. It is my money. It is the inheritance of Elijah Freeman given to his son Isaiah Freeman. And it is locked in an irrevocable trust. Marcus narrowed his eyes. He asked, what does that mean? I said, it means it is bulletproof. I have the best lawyers in the city. Stephen Vance drafted the papers himself. The trust has one beneficiary, me, and it has a specific clause about inheritance. I paused to let the words sink in. I said, you are legally disinherited. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It was the silence of a death sentence. Marcus turned purple. He sputtered, you can't do that. We are your children. We have rights. We will sue you. We will challenge the trust.
We will tell the court you are incompetent. I shook my head. I said, you can try. You can spend the little money you have left on lawyers, but you will lose. Vance has already prepared for that. He has the records of the eviction. He has the records of the unpaid loans I took to survive. He has the testimony of the landlord at the slum where I lived. He will paint a picture of abandonment so clear that no judge in this country will give you a dime. Andre started to cry. It was a pathetic sound. He said, Pop, please. I'm in trouble. I have gambling debts. I'm going to lose my house. I looked at him and I felt a twinge of pity, but I crushed it. Pity had made me weak before. I said, I know about the debts, Andre. I know about the gambling. I hired a private investigator. I know everything. And maybe losing your house will teach you the lesson I learned in that yellow room. It will teach you how to be a man. It will teach you how to stand on your own 2 feet. I stood up.
I buttoned my jacket. I looked at them one last time. They looked small. They looked defeated. They looked like strangers. I pulled a $20 bill from my wallet and dropped it on the table next to the untouched mozzarella sticks. I said, that covers my share of the water. You boys enjoy your meal. I turned and walked away. Marcus screamed after me. He shouted, you can't do this to us. You will die alone, old man. I kept walking. I walked out the door into the cold night air. I walked past the sad sedans and the minivans in the parking lot. I walked to the corner where my luxury car was waiting. I unlocked the door and slid into the leather seat. It smelled of newness and peace. I started the engine. It purred with a quiet power. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the neon sign of the restaurant reflecting in the glass. I didn't look back at the window to see if they were watching. I didn't care. I put the car in drive and pulled out onto the road. I was alone again, but for the first time in a long time, I did not feel lonely. I felt free. The chains of guilt were gone. The chains of obligation were broken. I was Isaiah Freeman. I was a millionaire.
and I had a lot of work to do. The war did not end the moment I drove away from the restaurant. I knew my sons well enough to know that greed does not surrender quietly. For the next 3 days, my phone was a battlefield. Marcus left voicemails that swung wildly from tearful apologies to screaming threats. Andre sent text messages begging for a loan, claiming that his bookie was going to break his legs. They were desperate men flailing in the quicksand of their own making. Then came the legal threat. It arrived in the form of a letter from a strip mall lawyer who probably drafted it between chasing ambulances. It claimed that I was mentally incompetent. It claimed that I had been coerced by Arthur Sterling and Stephen Vance. It demanded an immediate freeze of the trust assets pending a competency hearing. It was a bluff. It was a flimsy piece of paper trying to stop a freight train. I did not even respond. I simply forwarded the letter to Stephen Vance. Vance handled it with the cold efficiency of an executioner. He did not file a motion. He did not schedule a hearing. He simply sent a response letter to Marcus and Andre. In that letter, he laid out the timeline of the last 4 months. He attached the eviction notice they had served me. He attached the receipts from the pawn shop where I sold Eleanor's watch. He attached the sworn affidavit from my landlord testifying to the squalor I lived in. Vance closed the letter with a simple promise. He said that if they proceeded with any legal action, he would countersue for elder abuse. He would make the court filings public. He would ensure that every business partner and every neighbor in their social circle knew exactly how they had treated their father. He told them that he would not just bankrupt them, he would destroy their reputations forever. The silence that followed was instant and permanent. The phone call stopped. The text messages ceased. The cheap lawyer withdrew his representation. My sons retreated into the shadows, defeated not by money, but by the truth of their own actions. They realized that I was no longer the prey. I was the one holding the sword. With the legal threat neutralized, I had one final piece of business to attend to. I needed to close the door on the past, literally. I got into my car and drove back to the old neighborhood. It was a gray Tuesday afternoon. The streets were just as potholed and dirty as I remembered, but they looked different through the windshield of a luxury sedan. I felt like a tourist in my own misery. I parked the car in front of the crumbling building where I'd lived for 4 months. I saw the landlord sitting on the stoop smoking a cigarette. When he saw me get out of the car, his jaw dropped. He looked at the expensive suit. He looked at the shiny shoes. He didn't recognize me at first. He thought I was a health inspector or a police detective. When he finally realized I was the old man from room 3B, he nearly swallowed his cigarette. I walked past him without saying a word. I climbed the stairs. The smell hit me on the first landing. Urine, boiled cabbage, stale smoke. It was the smell of hopelessness. I walked down the dark hallway listening to the familiar sounds of the building, the couple arguing, the television blaring, the old man coughing in the room next to mine. I unlocked the door to my room and stepped inside. It was exactly as I had left it. The peeling yellow paint, the stained mattress, the hot plate sitting on the wobbly table. A dead fly lay on the windowsill. It was a cell. It was a coffin for the living. I stood in the center of the room and closed my eyes. I tried to summon the ghost of the man I had been. I remembered the nights I lay on that mattress shivering under a thin blanket. I remembered the hunger that gnawed at my stomach. I remembered the despair that whispered to me that this was the end. But standing there now with $32 million in the bank, I realized that this room had not broken me. It had forged me. It stripped away everything that was unnecessary. It showed me who I really was when the world took everything else away. It taught me that dignity is not a house or a car. Dignity is what you carry inside you when you have nothing else. I walked over to the table. I took the key to the room out of my pocket and placed it on the scratched wood. I looked at the hot plate where I had cooked my beans. I looked at the corner where I had prayed for a miracle. I spoke out loud to the empty room. I said goodbye. I said it with no anger. I said it with peace. I was leaving this misery behind, but I was taking the lesson with me. I would never forget what it felt like to be invisible.
I would never forget what it felt like to be hungry. I turned and walked out. I knocked on the door of the room next to mine. The old man who coughed all night opened it. He looked at me with rheumy, confused eyes. He was wearing a torn undershirt. I reached into my pocket and pulled out an envelope. Inside was $5,000 in cash. I handed it to him. I told him to buy some medicine. I told him to eat a good meal. He took the envelope, looking at me like I was an angel or a hallucination. He tried to ask who I was, but I just turned and walked away. I descended the stairs for the last time. I walked out into the sunlight. The landlord was still staring at my car. I got in and started the engine. I drove away without looking back in the rearview mirror. The building shrank in the distance until it was just another gray smudge on the skyline. I was done with the past. I was done with the pain. The road ahead was wide open, and for the first time in my life, I had the fuel to go wherever I wanted.
I did not buy a yacht, and I did not buy a private island. I bought a building. It was an old hotel on the edge of downtown that had been boarded up for years, a brick skeleton that everyone else had given up on. I hired a team of architects and contractors, and I gave them a single instruction. I told them to turn it into a home, not a shelter with cots lined up in a gymnasium, but a real home with private rooms and clean bathrooms and a kitchen that smelled of soup and fresh bread. We named it the Elijah Freeman Center for Dignity. It opened 6 months later. I stood out front and watched as the first residents moved in. They were people just like I had been, elderly men and women who had worked all their lives only to be discarded by a system that worships youth and profit. I saw the fear in their eyes vanish when they realized that no one was going to ask them for rent. I saw their shoulders drop when they realized they were safe. I spent my days there.
I did not sit in an office tower counting my millions. I sat in the dining hall eating lunch with a retired teacher who had lost her pension. I played chess with a former carpenter whose hands were too stiff to hold a hammer. I listened to their stories. I held their hands when they cried. I became the family they had lost. This was the true power of the money. It was not about what I could buy for myself. It was about what I could give back. Every time I signed a check to pay for a surgery or a warm coat, I felt a little bit of the weight lift from my soul. I was paying forward the debt that Arthur Sterling had paid to me. It was a chain of kindness that started in a bar in 1965, and it was continuing here in this building full of second chances. My sons tried to reach out one last time through a mutual acquaintance. They wanted to know if I would reconsider the trust. They wanted to know if there was any room for reconciliation. I sent a simple message back.
I told them that my family was here now. My family was the 80-year-old woman who knitted scarves for the winter. My family was the veteran who needed a wheelchair. My family was the people who knew the value of a kind word. One evening late in autumn, I sat in the small garden behind the center. The leaves were turning gold and red, falling gently onto the grass. I took out the photograph of my father. The edges were soft from how many times I had held it. I looked at his young face. I looked at the grease on his cheek and the wrench in his pocket. I spoke to him in the quiet of the twilight. I told him thank you. I told him that he had been right all along. He had walked away from his fortune to save us, and in doing so, he had saved me twice. He saved me when I was a child by keeping me safe, and he saved me as an old man by giving me a purpose. I told him about Arthur. I told him that his friend had kept his word.
I told him that honor was not dead, that it had just been sleeping in a safe for 60 years, waiting for the right moment to wake up. I looked at the building behind me with its warm yellow lights glowing in every window. I heard the faint sound of music coming from the common room. Someone was playing the piano. It was a melody that sounded like peace. I realized then that I was the richest man in the world, not because of the bank account, not because of the shares in the textile mill, but because I could go to sleep at night knowing that I had done right by my name. I had taken the pain of my abandonment and turned it into a shelter for others. I had taken the betrayal of my sons and turned it into a lesson on loyalty. I put the photo back in my pocket next to my heart. The wind picked up, blowing the leaves across the path. I stood up and buttoned my coat. It was time to go inside. It was time to serve dinner. It was time to be Isaiah Freeman.
We spend our lives chasing numbers, believing that security comes from what we accumulate. But the bitter truth is that a mansion built on selfishness is just a prison in disguise. My father Elijah never saw $1 million, but he died a king because he knew that a man's word is his bond. True inheritance isn't the money you leave behind, it is the example you set. It is the kindness you show to a stranger in a bar, and the integrity you keep when you are hungry. Be the kind of ancestor whose prayers protect your children long after you are gone.
If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more. And tell me in the comments, would you have given Marcus and Andre a second chance, or did they get exactly what they deserved? Until next time.